But today we're really very excited and glad to have Dr. Michael Kruger with us here, and he is the president and Samuel C. Patterson Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte. And he has his BS degree. He's a Tar Heel from North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His MDiv at Westminster Theological in California, and his PhD from the University of Edinburgh. And this morning he's going to share some personal things with us. And the title of this talk is Being a Christian in the Academy, Reflections on Challenges and Blessings, or perhaps How to Survive World Religion 101 or something like that at some point. So thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Well, good morning to all of you. Thanks for coming out this morning and taking some time out of your, I'm sure, very busy day to just share some time with one another and with me. And I want to say thanks for several of you coming out last night. It was a fun turnout. I think most of you were there, and those of you that weren't, I'm sure have heard about it. It seemed like a good crowd, and I was pleased to come and speak to the group that was there. Many students from what I could see as well, so that was nice. Now, as fun as last night was, and it was really sort of one of the main reasons I've come up, I was really pleased to hear that I had an opportunity to speak to this group this morning, because this, I feel, is more of a room filled with colleagues and a chance for me to just be with you, share a little bit of my story and some reflections on life in the academy. And I don't know if you normally do this, but at some point I'd love to hear your reflections, what life is like here at Virginia Tech. And I just think this is one of those rare opportunities where scholars can come together and talk about what it's like to be a believer in the midst of a scholarly community. So that's pretty rare. And truth be told, I don't have many opportunities to interact with groups like this. Not as a collective whole, at least. Most of the groups I interact with are going to be individual scholars in context of conferences, but sort of sitting in a room full of fellow Christian scholars is pretty rare. Obviously, I teach at a Christian school, so my fellow faculty members are followers of Christ, but at a university like this, I haven't had an opportunity to do this that often, so I'm pleased to be here and look forward to interacting with you. Here's what I want to do this morning. I don't know how these normally run, so forgive me if my approach this morning is out of sorts with the normal way it's done. Someone asked me a couple different times whether I had a presentation or a slideshow or some sort of technical thing, and I don't, as you can see, so you just have me, so hopefully that'll be sufficient. But what I want to do this morning is tell you a little bit of my own journey, my own story on the way to a career in academics, and sort of how I got where I got, and then I want to draw out some reflections on life in the academy. Now, as I do that, I recognize that my field is actually very different, I'm guessing, than most of your fields. And life as an engineer or a business person or whatever the different fields I'm learning about here this morning is not going to look precisely like mine, because I'm in that complicated world where I'm a believer teaching the Bible, right? And so my field is biblical studies and New Testament, and once you realize that, then there's a whole host of other complicated factors that come to bear. And so I realize that in many of your fields it may be a little different, just simply because there may not be opportunity as natural to bring things up that relate to your Christian faith. It may not be as front and center. In my world, it's front and center. Every time I lecture, I'm talking about the New Testament and early Christianity, so there's no way around it. So what I believe about these things versus what other colleagues believe about these things just becomes very apparent as we go. So I realize that there's not going to be a one-to-one application, but nonetheless, I think we all share the same sort of scenario, which is we find ourselves trying to faithfully follow Christ in the midst of what seems to be a very increasingly difficult place to do that in the academic world. And of course, we all know historically it hasn't always been that way. And I'm sure as faculty and as professors, you're well versed in the history of not only Christianity, but even in the history of the civilized world. It was actually Bible-believing Christians that often were at the high echelons of the academic community in prior generations. Particularly if you think about, a Reformation era Europe, it was very much that way. Now we feel probably very much not there anymore. And I won't rehearse all the cultural and philosophical reasons that got us here, but we're not in the position we used to be culturally. And that's complicated. It makes our jobs complicated. So let me tell you my story, and then we'll jump into some reflections, and then I do want to hear from you and what your life has been like here at Virginia Tech. My story, I won't give you my whole story. I grew up in a Christian home. with parents that were Bible-believing Christians and faithfully following Christ, and I was raised to believe in Christ, and genuinely did believe at a young age. And then I went off to college at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and I'll start my sort of reflections there, because I think that's where it gets relevant for the common ground, no doubt, that we share, because I imagine many of you may have had similar stories. When I arrived at UNC Chapel Hill, I was a committed believer, convinced of the truth of Christianity, trying my best to faithfully follow Christ. And before I arrived at UNC, I probably had an experience that most people have in their younger years, and that is the manner in which I was prepped for my university experience was not at all what I needed to hear to prep me for my university experience. The way I was prepped for my university experience, which is not entirely bad, but I just think limited, was that I was prepped to deal with my university experience on a moral level. And so I was told, here's what you're going to be tempted by in college, here's what college is going to make you want to do, and here's how you should live, and here's how you shouldn't live. And in a typical youth group fashion, before I was an undergraduate, I was told, look, when you get to university, the biggest problem you're going to face is a moral, ethical challenge. And you've got to be ready to deal with those moral, ethical challenges. Now, there's nothing inappropriate about that, I might add. I think that's entirely legitimate. And we do need to tell our young folks that, look, when you head off to college, you need to be ready to deal with some of those things. However, my prep as a believer was limited to just that. And so you know where this is going. I got to university environment, I had no intellectual preparation at all for what I was getting ready to discover and get ready to be hit with. And my biggest challenge, of course, wasn't moral. There's certainly moral dimensions to any student who goes off to college, but my biggest challenge was intellectual. And as I arrived at UNC Chapel Hill, I was bombarded with a number of intellectual challenges of faith that I had no idea how to handle. And first and foremost in all of that, and this is really the heart of my own situation, is that I found myself in a New Testament introduction class with Bart Ehrman. Now, most of you probably know the name Bart Ehrman, longtime professor at UNC, and has fashioned himself now as probably one of the leading critics of Christianity in the world today. Ehrman had just arrived as a brand new sort of rookie professor at UNC when I was there, and he was raring to go. And I found myself in his New Testament introduction class. This is long before he became famous like he is now, long before he had written any New York Times bestsellers. But I stepped in Ehrman's class and just got run over like a freight train hit me. And as you probably know, if you've read much of Ehrman's works, I mean, the attacks are fairly standard on the New Testament text and the New Testament documents and whether they're reliable and who wrote them, and whether they were written by authors who were eyewitnesses to these things. And Ehrman went through the whole gamut of criticisms of the Bible. Gospels contradict themselves, they're written late, they're written by people who never knew Jesus, they're full of mistakes, many of the books in the New Testament were forged, Paul didn't write half of them, you can't trust the Bible for much of anything at all, Jesus, we don't really know what he was like, and on it went for an entire semester. Now, if you're a scholar in a position that most of you are in, you can handle that as an academic and as an adult and as someone who's just been out in the world. For a freshman who knows nothing about much of anything, although freshmen think they know a lot, I found out very quickly that I was in intellectual trouble. So what was fascinating about that experience was I was not the only one in that camp. As I looked around, the class was enormous in size, 200-300 students. Several of my fellow evangelical friends were in there, and they were experiencing the same thing I was. And what I was noticing was the different reactions people were having to that scenario. And they were all over the range. Some people were bombarded with Bart Ehrman, and they just plugged their ears and pretended it wasn't happening. Then I had other believers in there who were starting to agree with him about what he was saying and trying to find a way to hold on to their faith and yet sort of concede all these critical views about the Bible. And then there were some who were chucking it to the curb entirely, who were saying, look, I guess I've been wrong all my life. I thought Christianity was true, it's not. Therefore, I'm just going to, kick it to the curb, and I'm starting off my university life, and I can kind of do what I want to do and live how I want to live and just start from scratch. All these options were on the table. By God's grace, I didn't take any of those three. I didn't want to plug my ears, pretend it wasn't happening. I didn't try to sort of mix it together in some sort of critical scholarship and evangelical sort of hybrid. And I certainly wasn't at a point where I was willing to kick my faith to the curb. So my reaction was different, and I don't credit this to myself, but simply, like I said, by God's grace working. I decided, look, I've got to get to the bottom of what in the world is going on here in the world of biblical scholarship. Now, I didn't pretend for a moment that I could solve these things as an undergraduate, but I did believe that I could start doing some serious study and research and at least get the other side. And I began to do that. And as I began to explore the other side, I started to enter into a whole world academically that I'd never really seen and understood before. And that world is the world that Bart Ehrman's sort of class went down that path. It was the world I ended up going in. That's the world of textual criticism. If you're into that or know anything about that, the transmission of the early New Testament text, the development of the New Testament canon, the sort of literary productions of early Christianity, and how Christians wrote, copied, and understood their writings. This whole field in a larger umbrella level is known as Christian origins, although Christian origins is bigger than that. And I found myself fascinated with that line of inquiry. I wanted to know not just sort of what the New Testament said, I wanted to, and what it meant. Of course I was concerned about that. I wanted to know how we got it, and how it was transmitted, and who wrote it, and how these things developed, and when were these books received, and when did Christians begin to acknowledge these things. So this was the place I began to explore. Now, as an undergraduate, I at least got enough information through my research to realize that Ehrman's story was only half. But in the midst of this, God was at work really directing me to a whole new career path. I was telling someone in the time this morning while we were having coffee that I actually started out at UNC in the Keenan Flagler Business School. When I arrived, I didn't have any inclinations that I would head down a scholarly path or a path in ministry, but as I began to deal with these things in my class intellectually, I began to realize, look, I feel like this is the direction I want to go. I want to really explore and study these things and see where God might take those. So when I was done at my undergraduate years, I went to Seminary at Westminster Theological Seminary out in California, and I got a good foundation laid biblically, theologically, doctrinally for just how to think about the Bible and how to understand things at a deeper level. But as you know, at a master's level and at a seminary level, much of my degree program, and this is right, was centered on how to sort of be in ministry and how to be in the church. So I realized that degree was just step one. And so after I got that degree, I did spend some time working in a church for a number of years, but inevitably knew that I was off to PhD work eventually. I found myself at the University of Edinburgh studying with Larry Hurtado, who, again, I don't presume everyone knows my field, but is one of the leading textual critical scholars in the world in biblical studies. And so I basically, when I decided to do my PhD work, I began to look around, who are the top guys in the world doing textual criticism? And who might be a top guy in the world doing textual criticism who isn't out to destroy evangelicals? It's a good second question, right? I could go study with lots of people, but who's at the top of the field, A, and who doesn't have any sort of overt hostility to Christians? And I asked that question for a very obvious reason, and that is there's well-known stories of Christians getting into PhD programs in biblical studies and really getting washed out by the faculty who oppose them, even their own advisors opposing them, and getting failed in their comps or in their final dissertation project based on people's own animosity towards them. And these stories were well established and well known, many of which had, of course, become apocryphal, and you never know what to believe after a while. But nonetheless, the legitimate concern of how to survive as a Christian in a PhD program, I had to ask the question, where could I go where I could be studying under one of the best scholars, but at the same time, not unwisely put myself in a position where I was going to be perhaps in trouble. So off to Scotland I went. My wife and I moved to Edinburgh. We haven't had kids yet at this point, and did my PhD under Larry Hurtado there at the University of Edinburgh. Last night, Sandy was reading off my bio. Where's Sandy? And thanks for not reading my doctoral dissertation title. People had got up and left at this point. So the title of my doctoral dissertation was, the main title was The Gospel of the Savior. The subtitle was An Analysis of P. Oxyrhynchus 840 and Its Place in the Gospel Traditions of Early Christianity. Oxyrhynchus 840 is an apocryphal gospel fragment from Oxyrhynchus, discovered in 1905. Published in 1908, and it's a story of Jesus not in our New Testaments. And I focused my PhD work on this apocryphal gospel fragment, and eventually ended up publishing it with E.J. Brill in one of their New Testament study series. And, you know, the intentional design there was obvious, is that on an academic level, I wanted to study actually books not in the Bible. And so I intentionally set out not only to study with Larry Hurtado, but to be interested in manuscripts, and then on top of that to study an area where very few evangelicals have a level of expertise in, and that is apocryphal gospels and texts outside the New Testament. And the whole goal there, I think, is obvious. Is it was designed to hopefully position me so that I could speak to issues that evangelicals don't want to speak to, and also a dissertation that could be written that I wouldn't necessarily get a lot of flack for in the academy. And this is actually part of what I want to talk to you about this morning, and I will as I enter into some reflections in a moment. Is, you know, it's one thing to talk about life as a professor as a Christian in a university, but it's another thing to talk about life as a PhD student, right? And what that's like, and how to be wise about it, and how much do you play your Christian cards on the table, and how much do you hold them close to your chest, and when do you do which? Those are very complicated questions, and I know that those questions come up as a professor in a faculty too. You're thinking, well, I'm a believer and I want to live faithfully as a Christian, and how often do I talk about it, and how much do I reveal about what I really believe, and what impact will that have on my career? These are all very real questions at the faculty level, but also at the PhD level. So as I navigated my PhD program, even though Larry himself was not hostile, the University of Edinburgh is a very, very liberal school, and our professors there, you could find one that would just believe about anything you wanted to believe, like most schools, right? If you wanted to believe Jesus was a magician who juggled, you could find someone who believed that. If you wanted to believe Jesus was, you know, more on the God Christian side, you could probably find someone who believed that. The University of Edinburgh was a wide open field. My time at UNC Chapel Hill, if you know anything about that, that is a very sort of diverse school, if I can put it that way. Not friendly at all to Christians in the broadest sense. And so both my undergraduate and my PhD work were spent at broad universities where I had to think about how to navigate a relatively hostile world for someone who believes the Bible. Now, that's how I got where I've got today. And since then, I've been teaching at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, New Testament professor, eventually academic dean, and my joke is they keep giving me jobs until they find one I can't do. Apparently, they may have found it, because they've asked me to be president of that campus, which I've been for the last 3 years. I still am writing and working on a number of projects. A number of the books I've written were mentioned last night, and I've got a couple more in the works right now. My main project right now is a book on Christianity in the 2nd century, which is being published by SPCK in the UK. My fellow Cambridge friend over here knows about SPCK in Britain, and then IVP Academic in the United States. That is a little bit of a background about me. Now, as I reflect on that in life in the academy, I just want to lay out some principles that I've derived from that, and then I would want to hear from you and what you've experienced. And the way I want to do the sort of reflections on life in the academy is actually to draw upon a very interesting book that I came across a number of years ago. And some of you probably have heard of this book. It's a book by a scholar by the name of Thomas Oden. That's O-D-E-N. And it's a book called A Change of Heart, a personal and theological memoir. Now, you probably don't necessarily know Oden because it's, again, I don't presume you know my field. There's lots of names in your field that I wouldn't know. But just to give you a background on Oden, Oden was a classic mid-20th century liberal biblical scholar. Did his PhD at Yale under Richard Niebuhr, studied all the big names, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, Bultmann, ended up sort of being mentored by Karl Barth, Gadamer, Pannenberg. He was enamored with critical scholarship, liberal theology, and he was your textbook professor in all those categories. He taught at Drew University for a long period of time. And then in the middle of his career, kind of like a light going off, Oden had a change of heart. Now, in his own mind, I don't know if you would define this as a conversion. I think he probably considered himself a believer in some sort of confused way at an early stage in his career. But he did have a change of heart, and as he had this change of heart, he found himself as a believing scholar, teaching Christianity in the midst of a very different world than he was once in. And what's interesting about his story, and this is of course different from mine, is that he started off on the critical side and then did a 180, which incidentally in the academic world, in my field, that just doesn't happen. I don't think I've ever heard of it happening. What happens is you start off as a Bible-believing Christian and sometimes you stay there, or you start off as a Bible Christian and you sometimes abandon it, but I hardly ever hear about someone start off as a liberal critical scholar and then becoming a Bible-believing Christian. Now there's a few exceptions out there in other fields, but in my field I don't know of another example besides those, which is a telling fact alone. And so he then went 180 degrees and he started teaching the Bible and started thinking about early Christianity differently. And his colleagues were absolutely mystified by this. They didn't quite know what to do with him. He had tenure at this point, which of course is a good thing, right? Yeah, note to self, when I do my 180, make sure I have tenure, right? So he had tenure and he began to teach historical Christianity, what Christians had taught for thousands of years, but his colleagues thought he had lost his mind. And they had turned on him and said, "You're ruining your academic career. You're throwing it down the toilet. You're ruining your reputation. Don't you realize that your colleagues now think that you've lost your mind? What are you doing?" And so what's interesting about his story is not only his turn back to historic Christianity, but the turn against him from his fellow colleagues. And this was a very interesting part of the story, and he found himself rather isolated and sort of hung out to dry. Now his story I'm sure could be replicated 1,000 times in various fields, but it's one of the most interesting stories I've read in a long time. And I've written on this on my website, and I just want to reflect, and this will be very brief, on the sort of 7 lessons I drew from his book. And they're not just from his story, they're actually from my story, I Trust Your Story. There's 7 lessons we all experience in the academy, whether you're in the field of biblical studies or not. One curious note about Odin, when he did his 180, actually what sparked his conversion was actually a Jewish friend. This was interesting. It wasn't a fellow believer. It was a Jewish friend who did at least have a traditional Jewish understanding of the Old Testament and had watched Odin's career being so kind of wacky off the rails. And his friend came to him one day, and they were good friends. And this is what his Jewish friend said to him: "If you're ever going to become a credible theologian, instead of a know-it-all pundit, you'd best restart your life on firmer ground." In other words, all your chasing of Freud and Marx, Nietzsche, and Volkmann is a mess, and you need to hit the reset button. And Odin said that when he heard that, it sort of hit him like a ton of bricks. And he's like, wow, maybe I am the sort of emperor with no clothes here. Maybe I thought I had it all together, it really didn't. And that's part of what sparked his turnaround. So let me walk through these 7 lessons, and then we'll get your reflections. Lesson number 1 that I think is true in my experience and also Odin's: contemporary scholarly methods do not always lead one to truth. This is one of the big conclusions he reached. When you're in the academy, and in my field, biblical studies, it is presented to you like this is the method, this is the way, and the conclusions we reach, which are the consensus, are absolutely unassailable. Now, you can quibble with minors. We'll let you do that. We'll let you sort of, ask questions about some of these micro issues, but the macro issues are decided. If you're going to be part of the guild, you need to realize these things are in stone. There's really no discussion. It's not negotiable. It's the way it is. And so Odin said that when he looked at modern scholarship, it was sort of this Goliath. They thought, you just can't touch that. But then when he had his 180, he began to look at the issues again. He realized, wait a second. These methods that I thought were so reliable, actually, I'm realizing now, don't necessarily lead you to accurate views of these things. In fact, he began to realize that a lot of things he thought were absolutely convinced conclusions of modern scholarship, he found uncompelling. He didn't find them persuasive at all. And he realized that methodologically speaking, that you're in a guild where methods themselves are ordained as well as the conclusions. And so you can't just question the conclusions. You got to go back and look at the methods as well. And he realized that those methods don't always lead to truth like you think. And that's a lesson, of course, he began to pass along to his students. Second lesson. Many of the questions raised by modern scholars, and this is about the Bible, so it's about his field and mine. Many of the questions raised by modern scholars have been addressed long before in the history of Christianity. Here's what Odin began to realize, because he never read evangelical scholars before this, and because he never read church history at any meaningful level before this, he thought all the issues being raised by critical scholars were issues that no one had ever dealt with before, and that no one had ever noticed before, and that no one had ever addressed before. So we thought what he was seeing was naive, head-in-the-sand Christianity for 2,000 years. And then, post-Enlightenment biblical scholarship finally was honest enough to take notice of things in the Bible that no one else bothered to notice. And by golly, that's why we're critical scholars, because we're going to make sure everyone hears about it. But then, when he started reading not only evangelical scholars, but the history of Christianity, it dawned on him, wait a second, these aren't new. And people have noticed these things for thousands of years. In fact, early Christians had noticed these things at the very beginning and dealt with them. In fact, there's been answers to these things along the way that he never even heard. Never even knew that anyone had any answers to these things. Don't even try to explain the other side of these things. I'll give you an example of this in my field, the whole question of the relationship between the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John, and whether there's an earlier source called Q. This whole question of the synoptic problem, no doubt you've read in your own experiences about. And people hear about Q and the synoptic problem in classes like Barton's, and they're wide-eyed and think, wow, this is brand new, never heard this before. People don't realize that Augustine dealt with that problem in the early church at length, extensively, and even before him we have interactions in the earlier centuries of Christian scholars who really recognize some of these challenges and begin to offer explanations and considerations and perspectives on it. The idea that the synoptic problem is new is not new at all. And what Odin began to realize is, wait a second, the only reason I was under the impression that there were no answers to these things, and under the impression that no one was bothering to look at these things, and that only critical scholars knew about these things, is I never actually read anyone else. All I was reading was critical scholars. Now, pausing on that for a moment, that tells you a little bit about the modern university's environment, right? Which the modern university environment is an environment where they're not really interested anymore in giving you all the different sides. They're interested rather in giving you their side, and you don't ever realize there's another side, which is really a letdown to our students. Our students need to know there's another side. Incidentally, in my Gospels class at RTS, I do give my students the other side. I have them extensively read and learn about critical scholars and their views. Obviously, I give my response to those views and give my perspective, which is different from those views, but I want them to not leave unaware of them. In fact, my students complain, why is it that I feel like the whole first half of Gospels is all German scholar, it's a list of German scholars, right? It's like a history of, 19th century, early 20th century German power criticism. I'm like, yeah, it is. And I don't want you leaving your education without knowing these things, because I'm not going to make the same mistake that I think Odin experienced and that we all know to some extent. Third lesson, the quest for originality and newness can be a dangerous one. This is the third lesson that Odin realized, and I think is true for my field and my experience, perhaps for yours to some extent. He was taught that the best way to do theology and the best way to develop doctrine was to think about things going forward. Where do we want to go from here? What new thing, what new direction can we uncover? What brand new perspective can we do? What thing can we create that's original, theologically and doctrinally? Now, we all know the pressure of scholarship, right? When you wrote your doctoral dissertation at some point, it had to be original. You can't just write something that's been done. When you publish your books and your articles in different pieces here at Virginia Tech, you have to do original research. So scholars are trained to be original thinkers, and there's something good and right about that. When I did my doctoral dissertation on the very boring Oxford Exam 40, one of the things that was an advantage at least is no one knew about it. No one had anything written about it, hardly, and so I had the opportunity to write a dissertation that hadn't been written. Okay, that's all good and well. And here's what Odin did that's pretty interesting, is he began to read the church fathers in a way he never read them before. He really read them. He read them at length. And he realized that the things we believe as Christians are not new at all, but very old. I know for you and I this is sort of obvious, people knew that intuitively, but you have to actually read the church fathers to get this, says Odin. And as you begin to read it, you realize that the way you do theology isn't by looking forward necessarily, although there's a place for that in a limited sense, but you do theology by looking back. You think about what Christians have said for thousands of years, and you begin to mine the jewels that were there in early Christianity. And he learned a lesson in humility, to be honest with you. And the lesson in humility is that as a scholar, my job isn't necessarily to be original, at least in this field. Now, in your field, that's very different. In the field in sciences, you want to discover something new, great, right? In theology, that's not really our job. And Odin's job, you can say it new ways, of course, but Odin's point is, theologically speaking, we actually want to sort of more faithfully articulate something that's not new, but something that's old. As a side note here, this was the perspective of the early Christians. Much of my work is in 2nd and 3rd century. And what I've noticed about 2nd century is that they often aren't trying to do anything new. They're always trying to articulate the apostolic message. They're not trying to come up with a new message. And that mentality has been true for Christians for a long time. 4th lesson, scholarly views have serious social consequences. One of the things that Odin recognized when he did his 180 is that, wait a second, what I've been teaching my students all this time, it hasn't just been the minutia of academic discourse. It actually has impacted their life. And as he reflected on his career, after he did his 180, he says, and I don't think it's been a positive impact. As I look back, I realize I haven't helped my students, I've hurt my students. And it began to dawn on him that what you teach academically actually has serious consequences in people's lives. Now, of course, in different fields, the direct one-to-one relationship in consequences is different, right? Again, in biblical studies, what you say about the Bible is going to have a lot of different consequences for people's lives versus what you say about, how you structure a bridge over a river. But nonetheless, everything we say is going to impact our students on one level or another, and Odin's lesson, I think, is a good one. And he actually had a lot of regret in his later life. You could say he sort of repented of that. He even went back and apologized and said, look, technically I just kind of led you people astray, which is really interesting. I mean, like I said, I don't know of any other story that parallels this. It's a very interesting thing. 5th, the modern scholarly community is not tolerant like people think. Now, I read out that reflection, and I think the chuckles I hear indicate. Feel free to come on in and have a seat. It's like churches, you get to sit in the front row. See,
I'm Baptist, but I've got to find
it. The issue of tolerance. Here's the impression that universities in our modern culture will give you: is that the intolerant ones are Christians, and the tolerant ones are the universities. They're the ones who are all about ideas, right? And the Christians are these dogmatic, narrow people who aren't interested in anything other than their little worlds. Odin believed that too. And after his 180, he said, wait a second, that's actually not true at all. Because after his 180, he realized no one was accepting to him. No one was tolerant of his views. Despite the fact that his views weren't new, despite the fact that his views were historically and traditionally Christian for thousands of years, despite the fact that it was historically rooted, despite the fact that it has a long pedigree, despite all these things, he wasn't accepted or tolerated at all. In fact, the animosity towards him was quite severe. Now, as I reflect on that in my own life, and I know you probably have much to offer here, which I want to hear from in a moment, that is a real situation in our community today. The idea that the universities are tolerant places is simply not true. They're not interested in multiple views. In fact, the hostility and the negativity towards anyone who disagrees with the orthodoxy of modern cultural and university settings is telling. And we all know stories of people whose careers have been ruined, who have lost their jobs, who didn't get tenure. I mentioned stories of people in the PhD programs that didn't either get in or when they got in were seriously opposed. I can tell you stories of my own students who applied to PhD programs in biblical studies. I had a student a number of years ago who was probably one of the brightest students I've ever had. He got almost a perfect score on the GRE. He missed one question on the GRE. Basically a perfect score. He was off the charts in his understanding of the original languages. He'd written some very fine academic pieces, had great scholarly recommendations, and he applied to all the major programs of divinity studies in the United States he would apply to, whether it be Princeton, Duke, Harvard, Emory, and so on. And he got into precisely 0 of them. Now, you look at a thing like that and you're thinking, how does that happen? And you realize that can't happen if schools are admitting students on the basis of academic credentials. That only happens if schools admit students on a whole bunch of other grounds. And no doubt it didn't help him that he had a degree from us, sadly, because they would have recognized our school not as a critical school, but as an evangelical school, and so that would have probably not served him well. That tells you a little bit about this, and Odin's story is the same we could all tell, which is, look, he realized that he thought he was positioning himself on the side of the tolerant ones, but in fact, he found out later that the university environment he was in was not. Lesson 6, a faithful voice can have a significant impact. A faithful voice can have a significant impact. One of the things that Odin felt after he made his 180 is that he was the lone voice no one was listening to, and he labored on for years, discouraged, feeling like it didn't matter. But then towards the end of his career, what's interesting is that he began to realize that he did have impact. People were listening to him. There were his students and his selected colleagues and people out there that were being blessed by his stand for truth. And that's a lesson I think we can all share today, which is that no doubt as you labor in your fields here at Virginia Tech and probably wonder, making any difference being a Christian here, you don't have to be the majority to have an impact. You don't have to be, a person who's in a big crowd to have an impact. Your solo lone voice, faithfully lived out, can have an impact. And he writes later, Odin writes this: I at times imagined that I was the only one who was on this eccentric path backward from modern accommodation to classic Christianity. But as I learned to listen to the life stories of others who had a similar trajectory to mine, I found their companionship encouraging. He began to realize he wasn't alone in this. And then finally, the last lesson, lesson 7. Modern ideologies will eventually collapse under their own weight. His takeaway in Odin's career is that what seems to be the dominant view eventually just ends up not being the dominant view. It collapses on itself, and then it's replaced by yet another view, and then you can be assured that'll eventually collapse on itself if it's not grounded in God's word and on a biblical worldview. And he said, look, don't be daunted by that. The example he gives in his book is the example of modernism, which of course now we all know as we look at the postmodern world we live in. Modernism looked like the unassailable behemoth of the day, and now it's old news. Now of course we know it's not really old news intellectually, because we know we live in a world that's both modernistic and postmodernistic in a hybrid sort of way, and that people are both, even when they don't realize it. That aside though, on an intellectual scale, postmodernity has replaced modernity. And modernity is now looked at as passé. And so he raises in the book, well, what's going to replace postmodernity? He goes, well, I don't know what's going to replace it, but on one level, the point is it doesn't matter what replaces it. Here's what's interesting. Every new idea that comes along, generation after generation in the academy, eventually implodes on itself. But what stands the test of time? And he says, look, this is why it's been so exciting to read the Church Fathers, because as he looks back, he sees, wait, these views have stood the test of time. They've been around for a long time, and they're going to be around for generations to come, because they're grounded in God's Word. They're not going to just be changed. Now, that's not only true in his field, it's true in the theological world. There's dominant paradigms that reign, and you look like they're never going to change, and then they collapse and disappear. And you look back and go, why did everyone believe that? It's like this weird sort of experience. And in the sciences, this is true too. There are paradigms that reign, and they look unassailable. And then they collapse on themselves. And then when you look back, you're like, who believed in the steady state theory of the universe? Now everyone knows it's the expanding Big Bang, right? Who believed that? And you look back and you realize that Thomas Kuhn was right in his book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which no doubt everyone probably carries around in their backpack here at Virginia Tech, right? You know well Kuhn's book. It's a standard work in philosophy of science, which is that science doesn't work in a linear fashion either. It's all about paradigms that get raised up and then they collapse, and you get a new paradigm that raises up. It's cyclical, and Odin's point is simple. What's not cyclical is the biblical worldview. It stays steady in the midst of this circular thing. And so you can rest in that, not panic at the latest thing that comes along in whatever academic discipline you're in. So those 7 lessons are from Thomas Odin's book, A Change of Heart. If you're a person who's interested in this sort of thing, and all of you are scholars at a university, I recommend you pick that book up and read it. It's very encouraging and interesting. And now, granted, you may get bogged down in some of his backstory in his field, which I know isn't necessarily your field, but I think it's a great lesson. And that really resonates with me in my story, because now I find myself in a situation where my writings and my academic papers and so forth, I always have in my mind when I write, I know we all do to some extent, that I'm going to get piled on by my academic colleagues about this statement. I'll write a sentence and I labor that sentence for days. I'm like, okay, how do I say this to minimize what I know is going to be the reaction to it? And there's an inevitability there when you write academic papers in a field like that you just sometimes got to just take it on the chin. And it doesn't matter what I write to some extent. If I write anything that resembles a Christian worldview, I'm going to find opposition. And so it's been a challenge. And what I do is I find myself in a very odd place, because I kind of have a foot in the evangelical publishing world, and I have a foot in the academic publishing world. So I have publications with E.J. Brill, and I have 2 different publications with Oxford University Press. And then I also have and then various academic journals like that, New Testament Studies and Journal of Theological Studies. And then on the evangelical side, I'm published with evangelical presses, whether it be InterVarsity or Crossway and so on. So I'm sort of unique because in my world I have a foot in both, and I get asked a lot by people, how do you navigate that? You've got an evangelical audience over here, you've got an academic audience over here, or I guess a better way to say it is maybe a non-evangelical audience over here, and it's complicated. That's probably different than your life. I doubt that you're publishing in those two same worlds, but I think it makes for an interesting point of reflection as we consider what it's like to be a Christian in the academy. Okay, so I said that I wanted to reflect on my own academic career and then give some 7 lessons, and I don't know if it's normal practice or not, but today it will be. I want to have a chance to hear what your experience has been like, whether you resonate with one of those 7 things, or several of them, and any other thoughts or comments you want to make about this sort of experience that we all share to some extent, being Christians in a scholarly world. So, who's my host here? Introduce me. Yes, is that okay? Can we
Yes,
do that?
absolutely.
Yes, okay.
Please.
Let me turn it over to the group here, and like I said, feel free to interact with what I've said this morning, and theoretically, if you were there last night and want to interact about some of that, I don't think that's off limits either, so.
All right, I'll break the ice.
Yes, please.
So I thought it was interesting the point on originality.
Yes.
And I think it's, I see it a completely different way.
Yep.
In the sense that when you talk about originality of Christian theology, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
But one of the things our students face is still the same pressure to create original research.
Right.
And what I think is I would say is very easy to identify in academia, even from well-established professors, is that their force on originality on their students drives them nuts and drives them to make up stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, you feel compelled to come up with something new, and then you actually end up losing some academic credibility to get to the new thing.
Well, sometimes you don't lose that credibility.
Yeah, you should lose that credibility. You're saying no one notices?
Well, sometimes they don't, right? So,
Yeah.
for example,
People can get away with it, though.
I mean, I have a very clear example, especially at the very beginning of my career. I shared a lab with a couple of professors, and I trained all their students in their equipment use, and then I found out that they were using it wrong, and I found out that they knew that they were using it wrong, and then I still saw the publications come out. Right, so now we're sitting in a very interesting crossroad where we could write papers of rebuttal.
So, one of the things you're, yeah, that's another issue.
As long as you write papers.
Absolutely.
So what you're saying, if I'm hearing you rightly, is the pressure to be original is not only problematic theologically, you're finding it to be problematic to some extent even in the sciences. Now that doesn't mean that originality is bad in the sciences.
No.
You're just saying that, because I agree with that, I think originality in the sciences is different than originality in theology. But you're just saying the pressure to get there leads students to take shortcuts.
Well, it's another thing altogether as well. So I mean, my experience in academia has really been geared towards my students, right?
Yeah.
And it's very interesting to see how students get totally frustrated when science doesn't work their way. And I think science is more like an archaeology, right?
Interesting.
Where you try to dig out what's underneath and you try to fit models and they don't work, and you throw out parameters and you bring in new parameters, right? And you try to see how things work. Yet if you don't find that, then you're, for lack of a better word, a loser, right? And then you see students who are working honestly and earnestly and and put out their first publication. And you turn around and see this guy graduating with 20 journals, right? And you're like, wow. So then, the students who are really earnestly trying to do these things the right way also get compared, right?
Yeah.
And then see the what you acquire gets really brought into your identity, right? You are your CV, right?
Right,
Academia,
right.
when you don't have the cross behind you, you are your CV,
Right.
right? So this force for originality, I see it in a very different way, but kind of the same way, and identifying yourself with what you see.
Yeah, there's so many interesting points you raised there. I mean, one of the interesting points you raised there is the way we fashion our identity around our academic accomplishments, which obviously for believers, we've got to be careful with that. Not that we don't want to make academic accomplishments, of course we do. God calls us to excel, whatever he calls us to. But that we don't make that our identity point. The other thing you raised is that there's always one of the great places that we can represent Christ in our fields is by academic integrity. And when we see things happen like you described, we can be, encouraging academic integrity and at least exemplifying it, if nothing else. But let me add a third thing on that. The idea that I'm frustrated, someone who looks at a scientific experiment and says, I'm frustrated it didn't work out like I wanted it to, it ought to have gone this way. And therefore I'm going to try to make it go that way, is I think a product of a postmodern world we live in. In other words, people are used to just fashioning truth to fit whatever they want it to be. We've been telling people for generations now that truth is a construct of the self. And you might be able to get away with that in a theological world, but you can't get away with that in a scientific one. Which is why, by the way, I'm convinced that scientific schools or schools like this tend to have more believers around. Because I think reality is you can't just fake it. But I think what you find in that instance is that people end up trying to fake it anyway. And I think that you just, that bet to try to make it be what it ought to be is, I think, this idea in people's minds of, well, look, 2 + 2 doesn't have to equal 4, it can equal 5 if I want it to, and let me just try to force it that way. So those are interesting reflections. Yes, right in behind them there. Yes. No? Just scratching your head. Okay, over here. All right.
I think the experience in the sciences, though, has been people never get away with that, at least in anything that's important, because it's always tried to be replicated by somebody else, and they find it. So I think it's just self-correcting in that regard.
Yeah, and I'm out of my field when it comes to the sciences, but I would imagine that if someone tried to publish research that was off, that they would get.
Not just imagine, that is the fact.
Yeah, it would
It
get noticed.
always happens
Yeah.
in anything that's important. If you publish something that's nonsense that nobody cares about, okay, it'll disappear in the literature.
Yes.
It won't have any effect. But if you cheat on your experiments and
Yes.
on your publications on something important,
Mhm.
you're found out immediately and your
Right.
reputation is destroyed.
Yeah.
Honesty is the coin of the realm.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's got to be that way.
But just to counter to that, every one of us who are on a large competitive grant for a government agency have had to go through the honesty training that NSF and USDA and others are requiring. And
They have honesty training?
Yeah, well, it's academic integrity, and you have to go through this 12-hour course or whatever it is. I think it's about 6 if you actually read everything. But
Gotta be honest about that. Cheating on an honesty course is a little bit.
you have to make a
Did you read all the material? Yes.
Yes, I do. But you have to make it 70. I passed with a 95. The bottom line is, the reason I passed was really, it's everything I learned in Sunday school.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at here is actually the whole idea of having integrity and being honest and executing your discipline this way is actually, those are Christian values and Christian principles built on a Christian worldview.
And the other point is that NSF is saying there are people dishonest out there.
That's right.
So we're requiring them.
I think, we're not suggesting that only Christians are honest. That's not the point. But I would suggest that the Christian worldview provides the foundation for why someone should be. I think a lot of people are honest without a reason. And I think most people go through life with morality being a lot like that. They have all kinds of moral views they hold that might be the same ones we hold. The question is whether you hold the same. The question is, do you have a reason in your worldview for holding it? And I think we obviously as Christians have a good reason for being honest. Yep.
I wonder if other departments have had the same experience. When I went through, I was able to do research in and for evangelical seminaries without a believer on my committee, except Dr. Reese, who came in. And post-modernity seems to allow you to be very honest about your presuppositions, and as long as they're not presented in an offensive way. It's not just in my department. We've had several PhD students. One just last week had his prelim in agriculture. His committee knew he was a Christian. None of them are Christians, but they said, what are the 4 questions? What does your Christian faith have to do with your research? And another guy at STS with Professor Goodrum, who you might know is rather hostile. He's on his committee, and he was able to be very honest. As an evangelical, I'm looking at this question. So do you think that maybe post-modernity is, in many departments now, opening up the opportunity to ask questions of what Christian faith has to do with it? That was my experience.
Yeah. No, I think what you're raising is an interesting point, and this has been observed by a number of folks, and that is that post-modernity, for all its negatives, and of course there's no, any of these, whether it's modernity or post-modernity, there's parts of those things that are good and parts that aren't, right? So modernity has some good parts and some bad parts, post-modernity has some good parts and some bad parts. One of the sort of, you could say, positive results of post-modernity is that it gets the issue of worldviews and presuppositions on the table more directly. We know that one of the problems with modernity was almost this naive, positivism where you could just go out and look at the facts and come up with conclusions, and that's all it took. And after a while, I was like, it doesn't work that way, right? You're seeing things through a grid, through a worldview, and therefore your perception of something is something different from another person's perception of something. So yeah, I think one positive of post-modernity, along with many non-positives, is that it does allow people to get their worldviews on the table, perhaps in a way that wouldn't have been allowable in a prior generation. However, the problem then is, even though that happens, I think two things take place. One is certain worldviews just aren't allowed to be on the table, or if they are, they're ridiculed once they get there. And the second is that sometimes, even after acknowledging your worldview and acknowledging sort of this presuppositional reality, lots of times people then just shift back over to modernism again. And so they're like a moving target. And this is one of the frustrating things that my students experience when they evangelize somebody, when they try to tell them about Christ. On one level, they're like, well, who knows what anyone believes, or it's kind of this hands in the air postmodern reaction. Then when you press them on something, then they back up to modernity again and go, well, the scientific evidence is against that. And I'm like, well, I thought you said you couldn't know anything. And it's like back and forth. And so I feel like that's part of the issue we're facing in our culture today. So good observation. Yes, another comment.
To reflect on your question, what is it like here? This is
Yes.
my personal opinion. Okay, I would say three things. We had April 16th, where we had over 30 people murdered on this campus.
Yeah, I
Okay.
can imagine that's still looming.
There's a group, it'll come up on year 10 next year. We have a group of 5 to 10 of us who've been praying together every week for 20, 25 years for God to work on this campus and to change this campus. Okay, so that's the second thing. Third, we have, arguably one of the larger group of Christians assembled, I think, no research, on a Christian campus.
So a lot of solid student
We-
groups.
Well, no.
Is that what you mean?
Faculty. Instead, we have 110 plaques on our mailing list of people who say Jesus Christ is Savior Lord.
Who are faculty?
Who are faculty.
Oh, wow.
And we have
Impressive.
50, 60 who are in the provost's office, professional staff, lawyers, okay.
Yeah.
So we have 200 or so. So we think God may be doing something. Now, okay, so I'm coming with the question. I can see with that background that God may want to do something, and he may want to do it here, and he may want to do it with people besides us. This isn't about, it's got to come through us,
Sure.
okay? And I can see immediately some defeat or belief courses that we could put together, maybe not offer in university, but we get, like what you did last night. I mean, we need permissions and all, we don't got no permissions. But the thing you did last night, that would really help. We have another one on gender and identity and things like that. These, et cetera, the post-present, we have several of those kind of talks that aren't state-of-the-art, but could be given to PhD students, new Christian faculty, could be done at churches and Sunday schools, et cetera. So, I mean, feel free to say that's a good idea.
No, it's a great idea. In fact, I think what you're really getting at here is, this is the Christian Scholars Network, if I've got the title right. Am I right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question is, does the Christian Scholars Network have a plan that would be sort of more systematic for really advancing the cause of Christ on the campus, or is it sort of less, developed? I think what you're suggesting is, look, maybe we should have a series of these lectures, maybe we should have a series of these classes. Maybe you already do that. I'm just showing up one day. What do I know, right? But your suggestions sound very intriguing. You could have a little series on multiple topics. Mine obviously would be on the Bible half. Don't invite me to come back for the gender discussion. That's a whole other thing. Might be a change there. But I think having some sort of structured network of lectures, classes, events, symposiums would be fantastic. And again, you guys may already be doing that. And I've been very impressed with the Christian faculty here. Coming from a UNC Chapel Hill background, man, I don't know if you could get every Christian faculty on campus, it wouldn't fill up even one of the rows here, in this room. So it's a very different environment. I'm convinced that you guys may be positioned in a very unique way, because my sense, and this is again 24 hours on the ground sense, is that a school like this, because it's a science-minded school, contrary to maybe more liberal arts schools like UNC, is going to, statistically speaking, have more believers both as students and as faculty. And providentially, you might have been dealt a very good hand in that way, and it could allow for certain kinds of opportunities that you would never be able to pull off at a place like Carolina, where you have just very few faculty. You have a good number of Christian students there, but the environment is so different than I'm sensing here. And I think because of the nature of the school, different schools have different personalities in this way. I was telling someone in the coffee time that one of the things I noticed at UNC, because when I was an undergraduate, I was actually in the business school. I noticed how different the business school was than the rest of the school. At UNC, it's crazy liberal everywhere. But then I got in the business school and I realized, wait a second, this feels very different. I realized that the discipline you're in actually can affect the flavor of what kind of people you attract. And I just think that as I look out at Virginia Tech, you have a situation where you have a really strong core of Christian faculty, and I think from what I can tell, a very strong core of Christian students. There's great opportunities here. If I can be of help in the future, I'll be happy to come back and be a part of that.
That's what I want to hear.
Let me know. So, should just ask that question.
He's an academic. He's got a
That's right. We don't ask that question. Yeah, right here.
This is my first time here, by the way. I'm Jonathan. I'm a second-year engineering professor. So my question is, the tension I feel as a scientist is not so much my department itself. I don't feel any tension there at all.
Sure.
It's more the broader university policy. And I'll give a specific example. And this is more a question for everyone, not just for you, since you said you didn't want to talk about gender identity things. So my department was strongly encouraged to attend at least one diversity workshop a year. I wanted to attend the unconscious bias workshop, but it was full. The only one left was the gender identity and expression. If you don't know the context, last year or 2 years ago, Tech added transgender and just alternate gender identities to their list of protected classes for employment. And what
Surprised it took that long. That's crazy. You guys have to be one of the last universities on the planet to have done that.
And what I imagine discrimination meant was not discriminating for job opportunities, and then obviously avoiding verbal and physical abuse that these communities sometimes have. So that was what I was envisioning this workshop would be about. And I was stunned the entire 4 hours. Not once was there even a nugget about avoiding job discrimination or equal opportunity employment. It wasn't even about that. The entire 4 hours was about espousing an entirely postmodern worldview of gender and just philosophy in general. And they explicitly said statements like there is no gender, gender is fluid, psychology trumps biology, biology is irrelevant, psychology defines reality. And what was implied, what was never explicit, what was implied very strongly was if you didn't have this postmodern view of gender, just postmodernism in general, that you were discriminating against transgenders and that you were not for diversity. So my question is, if this is going beyond just equal opportunity employment, if we're actually required to believe in these postmodern views to even be considered as being for diversity, where do we go from here? It seems like we're sort of at this line drawn in the sand, and we're not for diversity because we don't believe in postmodernism.
Hey, let's talk about diversity and tolerance. Oh, but we're going to not be tolerant about these 7 views, which is in essence what's going on. And the hypocrisy of that has been pointed out so many times that when I think about our postmodern world, I'm like, I don't know how many more times we can point this out to you. The hypocrisy of saying that you're for tolerance when you're just intolerant of Jews, Christians, historical people, biologists, and all these different folks. Don't you see the incongruity there? And after a while, you realize they actually don't care about that. They don't care they're inconsistent. It's not about being consistent. It's about promoting a view. And so the word tolerance is just an umbrella, meaningless term that they hide behind to promote one view. But they get people believing it's for tolerance. And so I don't have a solution, of course, to what you just described. If I did, I've written a book on it already. And I can simply point out the frustration of it. I will point out the inevitability of it here, and that you've got an example again of the claim to have tolerance when there really is none. That whole thing is shocking in the scientific community because like no gender. We're all scientists here, there are X and Y chromosomes, last time I checked, and so there are genders. And so you realize what's going on here has got to be bigger than intellectual. There's a spiritual thing happening there where people insist on behaving that way. We just got to keep praying for your campus and plugging along, but I sympathize with that. And of course, the fact that this is a little late to the game for Virginia Tech is a good thing. I mean, I think you were doing this in Chapel Hill 20 years ago, so.
Maybe there's time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up, and people can stay around if they'd like to move on. Any other?
Your final thought question? Yes?
Well, tagging on to that one a little bit, I know you probably prefer to change topics, but Lauren and I yesterday received an email in the College of Business inviting us to an all-day conference tomorrow that discussing the business and economic case for LGBT diversity and inclusion, which it's going to be probably a lot more of the same.
It's going to be the same, yeah.
Yeah, but I almost asked you this question last night, but didn't know if you wanted to address it in such a large audience, maybe you would here today. There's a lot of, you were talking about alternate gospels last night, and there's alternate interpretations of Scripture on this topic of human sexuality. As a New Testament scholar, what is your view on those issues?
I think what you're getting at there is what happens when people try to say that this gender confusion is consistent with the Bible. The Bible supports it. How do we respond to that? Is that kind of where you're going?
Exactly.
Yeah, this is a question I get a lot. So this is where the gender issue overlaps with my world. Is what does the Bible teach about it? And there's a lot of people today who will say, no, that the Bible supports this sort of gender confusion and it's okay. There's several ways to address that. One is there's a lot of very solid books by modern scholars dealing with the text of the Bible and what they teach. And I think it's hard to dispute the fact that the Bible teaches what it teaches about human sexuality. So I just think there's no doubt about it. But the other thing that I do as a scholar is not just talk about how to rightly interpret a text, but this is where I go back to Odin's book again. He says, look, you can't just ask what counts as a Christian view by simply doing exegesis, although that's the first step. But then you go back in church history and say, what have Christians always believed about this? Here's what's interesting is one of our own professors at RTS, Don Fortson, has just published a book called Unchanging Witness. And he's done something I haven't seen anyone do yet, is he has explored the history of the church's view on sexuality in conjunction with what the Bible says about it. And what he shows is that there isn't just a majority of Christians in history that take the traditional view of sexuality, but an absolute, overwhelming, no negotiable view for the history of the world. In other words, for 2,000 years, the church has been unequivocal, absolutely clear that this is what the Bible teaches, and it's only until now that someone says it doesn't. And that's a pretty stunning fact. And so when I help people understand how to think about this biblical, I look, of course, I think the exegesis of the text is clear about these things, but then on top of that, you have uniform witness of church history. In other words, if you suggest the Bible doesn't teach that, you're standing against not only what the Bible seems to clearly say, but you're standing against 2,000 years of church history. And at that point, what I encourage people to do is just simply admit your view is not the Christian view. That's what I wish people would do, be more academically honest. Rather than trying to say Christianity supports this, just admit your view is not the Christian view. Just say, look, okay, I disagree with the Christian view. That's much more academically honest. Just step out and say, honestly, Christianity teaches X, I believe Y, I think Christianity is wrong. That's a much more honest approach than try to hijack Christianity and make it back what you say. I wish people would do that more, but anyway, we'll leave it at that. I know we're over time.
Thank you so much, Mike, for coming. Let's close with a word of prayer, and then if you'd like to stay around and talk for a few more minutes, that's great. Lord, we just thank you for our brother and bringing him here, and we pray you bless him and the remainder of his visit and give him a safe travel home. And we thank you for this time and the freedoms that we have here to talk about these things. And we pray in the name of Jesus.
Amen. Thank you.
Thanks, Church.